the great hall of the Froststone Keep was a symphony of forced cheer. Hundreds of candles fought a losing battle against the ancient, cold-soaked stone, their light seeming to freeze and fracture in the air before it could offer any real warmth. Laughter echoed, thin and brittle, from lords and ladies draped in furs and velvets, their breath pluming in the chill that even the grand hearths could not banish. For Ilara, the chill was both external and internal, a familiar companion that had clung to her since birth. It was the cold of being unseen, unheard, a ghost in her own family's orbit. Her cousin, Lady Seraphina, glided through the throng, a vision in crimson silk, her smile as sharp and beautiful as a shard of ice. She stopped before Ilara, who stood by a service pillar, holding a silver tray laden with goblets of deep red wine. Seraphina's eyes, the colour of a winter sky, raked over Ilara's drab grey servant's dress, a deliberate insult for a distant cousin of noble blood. "Still lurking in the shadows, Ilara?" Seraphina's voice was a sweet poison, meant only for her. "One would think you'd be used to it, but the king requires more wine. Do try not to spill it. We wouldn't want you to draw any untoward attention to yourself. It would be such a shame." The command was a public humiliation disguised as a simple instruction. To be forced to serve at a royal banquet when she should have been a guest, even a minor one, was the final turn of the screw in Seraphina's long campaign of cruelty. Ilara felt the familiar weight of it settle in her chest, heavy and cold as a river stone. But she did not let it show. She met her cousin's gaze, her expression a mask of quiet composure, and gave a single, shallow nod. To fight, to protest, would be to give Seraphina the satisfaction of a reaction. Silence was her only shield. From his throne on the high dais, King Kalin observed the scene. He saw everything and felt nothing. The hall was a tableau of meaningless motion, a collection of sounds that never quite reached him. For 100 years, this had been his existence. A king entombed in ice while still breathing. His curse was a silent thief, stealing the warmth from his skin, the beat from his heart, the colour from his world. He was a monarch of ash and frost, his emotions a vast frozen tundra where nothing grew. He ruled with a precision born of this emptiness. His judgments were absolute, his commands unyielding. His subjects feared him, for his coldness was a palpable force, a physical presence that radiated from him and settled deep in the bones of his castle. They called him the Frost King, the Winter Heart, a man whose soul had been lost to the eternal cold. They were not wrong. He felt the gazes upon him, a mixture of awe and terror, but they were like pebbles thrown against a glacier. They left no mark. He watched the girl in the grey dress move. There was a stillness about her, a self-contained dignity that stood in stark contrast to the frantic posturing of the court. She navigated the crush of bodies with an unnatural grace, her focus entirely on the tray she carried. He tracked her progress as she ascended the steps to the dais, his gaze a detached, analytical thing. Another servant, another task. It meant nothing. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ice. Each step toward the throne felt like a mile. The king's presence was overwhelming, a vortex of silence and cold that pulled all the warmth and sound from the air around him. The silver and white of his tunic seemed to absorb the candlelight, and his eyes, the colour of a frozen lake, were fixed on a point somewhere beyond the hall, beyond life itself. He was beautiful, in the way a winter storm is beautiful, terrifying and remote. She reached his side, her hands trembling slightly. She could feel the stares of the entire court on her back. Seraphina's mocking smile was burned into her mind. She focused on the simple mechanics of the task. Lift the goblet, place it on the table. Do not falter. But as she leaned forward, a lord jostled his chair, his elbow catching her arm with just enough force to upset her delicate balance. It was a small thing, an insignificant accident, but it was enough. The glass tipped, the wine, dark as blood, landed. It was a slow-motion catastrophe. The crimson liquid arced through the air, a terrible, beautiful ribbon of colour against the stark white of the king's tunic. It splashed across his chest, a shocking stain on the pristine fabric. A collective gasp sucked the air from the great hall. Laughter died, conversation stuttered into nothing. The scrape of a fork on a plate sounded like a thunderclap in the sudden, absolute silence. Every eye was fixed on the small grey figure standing frozen beside the throne, and on the king whose stillness had just been violated. Elara felt her blood run cold, a true, piercing cold that had nothing to do with the hall's chill. This was it. This was the end. Public whippings were common for lesser offences. For this, for marring the untouchable person of the Frost King, the punishment would be unspeakable. She braced herself for the explosion of rage, for the guard's hands on her shoulders, for the long, painful walk to the dungeons. She closed her eyes, her inner strength a final, desperate wall against the terror. But the rage never came. Instead, there was only the profound, unnerving silence. It stretched for an eternity, thick and heavy. Elara dared to open her eyes. King Caelan had not moved. He was looking down at the stain on his chest, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. His gaze, those impossibly cold eyes, did not hold fury. They held something else. A flicker of confusion, a spark of life in the frozen depths. For the first time in a century, Caelan felt something. Where the wine had soaked through his tunic to his skin, a strange sensation bloomed. It was not warmth, not as he remembered it, but it was the absence of cold. A tingling neutrality, a ghost of feeling. It was so alien, so utterly forgotten, that it shocked him to his core. His curse was absolute. It did not allow for such things. Yet here it was. His gaze moved from the stain to the girl. She stood perfectly still, her head bowed, awaiting her fate. She did not cry. She did not beg. She did not tremble. She simply stood, radiating a quiet resolve that he had never encountered. In a court filled with performers and sycophants, her genuine stillness was a revelation. He felt an instinct, a deep, primal pull from the core of his being, a part of him he thought had frozen to death long ago. It was a curiosity so powerful, it momentarily eclipsed the gnawing emptiness of his curse. He needed to know. His voice, when he spoke, was low, raspy from disuse in anything but commands. It cut through the silence like a blade. "What is your name?" The question was so unexpected it was like a physical blow to the room. No one breathed. Lord Valerius, the king's ever-present advisor, took a half-step forward, his face a mask of disbelief. The king did not speak to servants. The king did not ask questions. He gave orders. Elara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. She had been prepared for a sentence, not a question. She looked into his face and saw, for the first time, not just a king, but a man. A man locked away in a prison of his own flesh. The raw, aching loneliness in his eyes was a mirror to the isolation she had felt her entire life. She found her voice, a small, steady thing in the cavernous silence. "Elara, Your Majesty." Seraphina rushed forward, her face pale with panic, falling into a deep curtsy. "Your Majesty, forgive her. She is my cousin, a witless, clumsy creature. I accept full responsibility. Please allow me to have her removed and punished accordingly." Caelan's eyes did not leave Ilara's face. He raised a single hand, a gesture that froze Seraphina in place. The faint tingling on his chest was already fading, the relentless cold seeping back in, and a desperate, unfamiliar panic seized him. He could not let it go. He could not let her go. "You will do nothing," he said, his voice now edged with the familiar steel of command, but the command itself was unheard of. "From this moment, she is no longer in your charge. She will serve me, directly, in my private chambers." He stood. The movement was fluid, powerful, and it sent a fresh wave of fear through the court. He looked down at Elara, his expression softening for a barest fraction of a second. "Come." Not a command, a request. Without a backward glance at the stunned hall, at the apoplectic face of Lord Valerius, or at the gaping disbelief of Seraphina, King Caelan turned and strode from the dais. And after a moment's hesitation, Elara, the invisible girl in the drab grey dress, picked up her fallen tray and followed him into the heart of the cold. The king's private wing was a realm of profound silence and deepening frost. Here, the curse was not a subtle chill in the air, but a living entity. Intricate patterns of ice, like ghostly ferns, crept across the window panes, even though the summer sun beat down on the world outside. The air was thin and sharp, stinging the lungs. Tapestries hung stiff and cold on the walls, their vibrant colours muted by a fine layer of rime. It was a mausoleum for a living man. Elara was shown to a small, Spartan room adjoining the king's vast chambers. A stern-faced housekeeper gave her a new uniform, this one of dark blue wool, and a list of duties. The king required nothing, the woman explained. He did not eat in his chambers, he did not sleep, he did not require the hearth to be lit. Elara's role was simply to be present, to tidy what did not get messy, to wait for commands that would likely never come. It was an imprisonment of quiet uselessness. For days, she existed in this frozen stillness. The king was a phantom in his own rooms. He would stand for hours at the frosted windows, staring out at a kingdom he could not feel. He would sit in a high-backed chair before the empty, cold hearth, a book open on his lap, though she never saw him turn a page. He moved without sound, a shadow in a world of shadows. And he watched her. Kaelin felt her presence like a solitary candle in an endless cavern of ice. It was a tiny, fragile thing, yet it was the only point of focus in his grey, featureless world. He watched her as she dusted furniture that was already clean, her movements economical and graceful. He watched her as she polished silver until it shone with a cold, hard light. He was waiting for the fear to set in, waiting for her to startle when he entered a room, to flinch from the unnatural cold that clung to him, to begin the subtle, cloying dance of flattery and manipulation that he knew so well. But she did none of those things. She met his gaze directly, her own eyes a clear, steady brown, holding neither fear nor ambition. She spoke only to answer his direct and rare questions. Her voice was calm, her answers concise. She did not seem to mind the cold. She did not seem to mind the silence. She simply was. Her composure was a fortress, and he had no idea how to breach it. It was maddening. It was fascinating. Lord Valerius, his face a thundercloud of disapproval, sought him out. They stood in the king's solar, the advisor deliberately positioning himself far from the frost-covered windows. "Your Majesty, this is a folly," Valerius began, his voice tight with restrained anger. "The court is whispering. To elevate a clumsy servant girl for spilling wine, it makes you look weak, unpredictable. Send her away. Let me deal with her." Kaelin turned from the window, his gaze so cold that Valerius involuntarily took a step back. "The court whispers because it has nothing better to do. And I am not weak. I am bored. She is different." "Different how?" Valerius scoffed. "She is a low-born nobody from a disgraced line. What could she possibly offer you?" "The absence of cold," Kaelin thought, but he could not speak those words. The curse was his secret, a shame he had carried alone for a century. "She offers silence," he said instead. "She does not fill the air with useless noise. That is more than I can say for most of my court. She stays. Do not speak of this again." The dismissal was absolute. Valerius bowed, his lips a thin white line of fury, and departed. He saw the girl, Elara, in the hallway, and his eyes narrowed with a venomous promise. He would not let this stand. The king's stability, and by extension, Valerius's power, depended on the rigid, cold order of things. This girl was a crack in the ice, and he would see it frozen over. Elara saw the hatred in the advisor's eyes, but it was a familiar venom. She had seen it in Seraphina's eyes her whole life. It did not touch her. Her focus was on the man in the room beyond. She saw past the crown, past the fear he inspired. She saw a prisoner. His suffering was a silent scream that echoed in the frigid chambers, a scream that only she, in her own lifetime of silent endurance, seemed able to hear. She did not pity him. Pity was a useless emotion. Instead, a strange, fierce empathy took root in her heart, a kinship with his profound isolation. One evening, A week into her strange new life, she entered his chambers to clear away a tray. A storm was raging outside, but within the castle walls the only sound was the faint, crystalline crackle of the frost as it advanced across the stone. Caelan stood at the great arched window, his back to the room. He was so still he might have been a statue carved from winter itself. A faint silvery aura shimmered around him, and the glass before him was thick with opaque, white ice. His hands were pressed against the pane, and she could see the stark white of his knuckles. He looked weary. Not just tired, but a soul-deep exhaustion that seemed to bow his broad shoulders. It was a vulnerability she had never seen in him, a crack in the glacial facade. Something compelled her to speak, to break her own rule of silence. She set the tray down softly and took a few steps toward him. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried in the stillness. "Does it ever stop hurting, Your Majesty?" The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and utterly devastating. Caelan froze, his entire world tilted on its axis. In 100 years, lords and ladies, generals and advisors, healers and sycophants had spoken to him. They had begged, flattered, advised, and feared him. But not one of them, not a single soul, had ever asked him if he was in pain. They saw the king, the power, the cold. He turned slowly, his face a mask of shock. He stared at her, this quiet, unassuming woman who had seen through a century of armor to the wound beneath. Her brown eyes were filled not with pity, but with a startling, profound understanding. And the dam of his solitude, a structure he had spent 100 years reinforcing, finally broke. "No," he breathed, the word a plume of white mist in the frigid air. "It never stops." He felt a desperate, terrifying need to tell her, to give voice to the agony for the first time. He gestured to the chair opposite his own, before the cold hearth. She moved without a word and sat, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze never leaving his. "A century ago," he began, his voice a low, gravelly thing, "I was not like this. I was warm." He said the word as if it were a foreign language. "I was betrayed. A witch, her heart spurned, laid a curse upon me, the curse of the unfeeling heart. It leached the warmth from my body and the feeling from my soul. I have not known a moment's peace or a night's sleep since that day." He held up his hand. In the faint candlelight, she could see it clearly now. His skin was unnaturally pale, and beneath the surface, faint, silvery blue lines pulsed with a cold light, like veins of ice. "The frost you see is not just on the windows. It is inside me. It feeds on my life, and in return it grants me this, control, this cold reason. But there is a caveat. The witch was thorough in her cruelty." His voice dropped, thick with a pain so ancient it was almost beyond expression. "If I were ever to feel a strong emotion, true joy, true grief, true hope, or love, the curse would interpret it as a final betrayal. The frost would cease to be my prison. It would become my tomb. It would consume me from the inside out, turn me to a statue of ice, and my death would plunge this kingdom into an eternal winter." He finished, the confession leaving him hollowed out, exposed. He waited for her reaction. He expected horror, fear, perhaps a frantic attempt to offer a cure. He was prepared for her to run screaming from the room. Ilara simply sat there, absorbing the weight of his 100-year agony. The sheer, crushing loneliness of it stole her breath. To be surrounded by people yet be utterly alone. To rule a world he could not feel. To have the one thing that makes life worth living, the capacity to love, be the very thing that would destroy him. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with an emotion he could not name. "No one," she said softly, a gaze unwavering, "should have to be so alone." She did not offer a solution. She did not offer pity. She offered something far more valuable, recognition. She stood and walked not to him, but to the frosted window where he had stood. She hesitated for a moment, then pressed her own palm flat against the cold, icy glass, just beside the fading handprint he had left behind. She did not touch him. She simply shared the cold with him, a silent, profound act of solidarity that pierced the deepest, most frozen part of his soul. In that moment, watching her small, warm hand against the ice, Kaelin felt the second ghost of a sensation. It was a flicker in the vast darkness of his heart. It was a terrifying, brilliant, and agonizing spark. It was hope. If you're enjoying this story and want to see more like it, please take a moment to like this video. It truly helps and lets me know what kind of tales you want to hear. Now back to the unfolding frost. The days that followed were different. A subtle shift had occurred in the frozen landscape of the king's chambers. The silence was no longer empty. It was shared. Kaelin found himself seeking out Ilara's quiet presence, a moth drawn to a candle flame he knew could incinerate him. He started asking her to read to him. He could not feel the warmth of the fire he now allowed her to light in the hearth, but he could hear the warmth in her voice as she read tales of sun-drenched lands and heroic love. The words themselves were meaningless, but the sound of her voice was a balm to his frayed, sleepless existence. It was the first comfort he had known in 100 years. Ilara, for her part, found a strange purpose in this cold, quiet world. She was no longer invisible. She was seen. The king's piercing eyes followed her, but his gaze was no longer just analytical. There was a raw hunger in it, a longing that he tried and failed to conceal. She saw the battle raging within him, the flicker of hope against the tide of his curse, and her heart ached for him. She began leaving small things for him to find, a single perfect wildflower she'd coaxed from the castle's neglected greenhouse, placed in a bud vase on his desk, a book of poetry left open to a particular passage about the dawn, small silent gestures of life in his world of death. One afternoon she was reading a legend about a sun-mage queen who could make deserts bloom. Kaelin sat across from her, his eyes closed, listening. As she reached the end of a chapter, she looked up to find him staring at her, his expression one of intense, painful concentration. "Your voice," he said, the words rough. "It feels like a memory of sunlight." The compliment was so unexpected, so deeply personal, that a flush rose to her cheeks. She closed the book, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "I am glad it brings you some comfort, Your Majesty." "Kaelin," he corrected her softly. "My name is Kaelin." It was an offering, a piece of himself he had not given to another living soul. She met his gaze, and the space between them crackled with an unspoken truth. The professional distance, the line between king and servant, had evaporated, leaving something far more intimate and dangerous in its place. Later that evening, he was working at his desk, reviewing a stack of decrees. Ilara brought him a cup of herbal tea, something an old kitchen maid named Anya had told her was good for calming the spirit, though she knew it would do little for a man who could not sleep. As she set it down, her fingers brushed against the back of his hand. A jolt, white-hot and electric, shot up his arm. It was not a ghost of a feeling, it was real. A searing, brilliant warmth that exploded at the point of contact. For a single, breathtaking second, the blue, icy veins in his hand vanished, replaced by the healthy colour of living flesh. He gasped, a sharp, ragged sound, pulling his hand back as if he'd been burned. Ilara froze, her eyes wide with shock at his reaction. She had felt it too, a strange thrum of energy passing between them. Kaelin stared at his hand, then at her. The warmth was gone as quickly as it had come, the cold rushing back in with a vengeance, more painful than before. But it had been there, it had been real. Hope, no longer a spark but a raging fire, roared to life in his chest. A terrifying, beautiful inferno. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just his salvation, but his damnation. To feel again, to live again was within his grasp, and it would kill him. The curse felt the hope. It felt the warmth, and it reacted with the ferocity of a cornered beast. That night, the pain began. It started as a dull ache in his bones, the familiar cold intensifying. By morning, it was a sharp, grinding agony. The veins of ice on his skin grew thicker, darker, creeping up his arms from his fingertips. The frost on the windows no longer looked like ferns, but like jagged, vicious thorns. The temperature in his chambers plummeted, and even Ilara, wrapped in a thick cloak, found herself shivering uncontrollably. Kaelin fought it with the iron will he had honed over a century. He refused to show the pain, refused to give the curse the satisfaction. But Ilara saw it. She saw the tension in his jaw, the sweat beading on his brow despite the Arctic cold, the way his hands clenched into fists to stop them from shaking. Lord Valerius saw it too, and he exulted. He found the king hunched over his desk, his breathing shallow. "You see, Your Majesty," Valerius said, his voice laced with triumphant concern. "I warned you. The girl is an anchor, dragging you down. Her presence is aggravating your condition. She is poisoning you with her common sentimentality. Send her away before it is too late." "Get out," Kaelin ground out through clenched teeth, the words a guttural snarl. The very thought of sending Ilara away was a physical pain sharper than that of the curse. She was the source of this agony, yes, but she was also the source of the hope that made the agony bearable. He would not, could not, let her go. The curse accelerated. Within a day, the ice had reached his shoulders, intricate patterns of it now visible on his neck, creeping toward his jaw. He grew weaker, the effort of merely standing becoming monumental. The eternal winter his death was prophesied to bring began its slow advance. The skies over the capital turned a perpetual slate grey. A cold, unseasonable wind swept through the streets, and the first flurries of snow began to fall on the summer roses in the royal gardens. Kaelin knew he was dying. The hope Ilara had given him had signed his death warrant. He collapsed, unable to make it back to his chair, and it was Ilara who found him, lying on the cold stone floor, his body rigid, his breathing a shallow rasp. "Kaelin," she cried, rushing to his side, her title for him forgotten in her terror. She tried to help him up, but his body was as heavy and unyielding as stone. His skin, where she touched his cheek, was no longer just cold. It was the absolute zero of a dead star, a cold that burned. The ice was now visible at his temples, a beautiful, lethal crown. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice faint. The hope, it was too much. His eyes, pools of frozen pain, found hers. "You should run, Ilara. When I am gone, the winter will have no end. Valerius will rule. He will not be kind to you." "I am not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce with a strength she didn't know she possessed. At that moment, the doors to the chamber burst open. Lord Valerius strode in, flanked by two of the royal guard. His face was a mask of grim, righteous authority. "The king is dying," Valerius announced, his voice ringing with false sorrow. "And you, girl, are the cause. Your presence has been a poison, a final catalyst for His Majesty's long illness. You are a witch, and you have killed your king." He gestured to the guards. "Seize her. She will be executed for treason at dawn." The guards moved forward, their hands reaching for her. Ilara scrambled to her feet, placing herself between them and Kaelin's prone form. She would not let them touch him. She would not let her last moments with him be this. As their hands fell upon her shoulders, a fire erupted in her chest. It was not a metaphor. It was a real physical heat, an explosion of power that had lain dormant within her for her entire life. A wave of warmth, golden and brilliant, blasted outward from her body. The guards were thrown back, crying out in shock as the heat seared through their armor. Valerius stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. What is this?" Ilara looked down at her hands. They were glowing, suffused with a soft golden light. A warmth spread through her veins, a power that felt as natural and as ancient as the sun. Memories, not her own, flooded her mind, a lineage of women with fire in their blood and sunlight in their souls. Sun mages, the ancient sworn enemies of the Frost Witch who had cursed Kaelin. It was not a coincidence that she had been drawn to him. It was destiny. She was the antidote. "You are wrong," she said, her voice now filled with a power that made the very air vibrate. "I am not his poison. I am his cure." Valerius's shock twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. "The old bloodline, I thought we had extinguished it. No matter, you will not save him. My family has been sworn for generations to uphold this curse. It contains his power, keeps him predictable, manageable. I will not allow you to undo a century of order." He drew his own sword, its polished steel gleaming in the golden light radiating from her. "If he will not die by the curse, then he will die by my hand, and you will follow." He lunged, not at her, but at the helpless form of the king on the floor. Ilara had a choice. A flash of rage, hot and righteous, surged through her. She could feel the power thrumming in her palms, enough to incinerate Valerius where he stood. Vengeance was hers for the taking. For Kaelin, for herself, for a lifetime of cruelty. But she looked past the charging advisor, her eyes locking on Kaelin. His life was fading, the ice now tracing patterns on his cheeks. Vengeance was a fire that consumed. What he needed was a fire that healed. She made her choice. Ignoring Valerius completely, she threw herself to her knees beside Kaelin. She placed her glowing hands on his chest, directly over his frozen heart. She closed her eyes and poured everything she was, her strength, her warmth, her nascent power, her quiet, fierce, and unconditional love, into him. Valerius's sword descended, aimed for Kaelin's throat, but it never landed. A wave of pure heat erupted from Ilara, a dome of golden light that slammed into Valerius and threw him across the room, where he crumpled against the far wall, unconscious. The world for Ilara and Kaelin narrowed to a single point of contact. Fire met ice. It was an agony and an ecstasy. She felt the vicious, sentient cold of the curse fighting back, trying to extinguish her, to freeze her from the inside out. He felt a warmth so intense it was like being forged anew in the heart of a star, burning away a century of ice and pain. A sound like 1,000 glaciers calving filled the room. The ice on Kaelin's skin did not melt. It shattered. It exploded outward in a cloud of glittering, harmless vapor. The frost on the windows vanished, revealing the grey, snowy sky outside. The unnatural chill in the room was obliterated, replaced by a gentle, life-giving warmth. Kaelin gasped. A deep, shuddering intake of air, the first true breath he had taken in 100 years. Colour flooded his skin. The silver-blue veins were gone. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his movements no longer stiff but fluid and alive. He looked at his hands, turning them over. They were the hands of a living man. He could feel the soft wool of Ilara's dress under his cheek. He could feel the solid stone of the floor beneath him. He could feel the frantic, joyful beat of his own heart. The curse was broken. He was free. He looked up at Ilara. Her light was fading, her strength spent. She was pale, her breathing laboured, but her eyes were shining with tears of relief. He reached up and cupped her cheek, and this time, there was no jolt of magic. There was only the simple, miraculous warmth of his skin against hers. Ilara, he breathed, his voice thick with a century of unshed emotion.